Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are viewing this webinar, I guess. My name is Brummel, and I would like to welcome you to the Design Patterns in ForNAV webinar. I will be moderating this webinar, so if you have any questions, just type them into the question box, and I'll answer them directly if I can. If I can't, I will present them to Mark, who will present the webinar at the end of the webinar. If the questions are important enough, then I will interrupt the presenter and ask the question immediately. With that out of the way, Mark, floor is all yours.
Okay, thanks. And yes, good morning, good afternoon to everyone. Welcome to this webinar about design patterns in ForNAV. My name is Mark Brummel, and I'm a senior product specialist in ForNAV. I would like to start the presentation with showing you a picture that I used when I was teaching my design patterns masterclass for programming CL code. If you know from which country I am, what this building is probably an easy guess. If you are not from the Netherlands, then it's probably a little bit harder. This building is the Binnenhof in The Hague. And in this building, the Dutch government tries to do its work. The reason that I'm showing you this building is to explain some similarities between the building and software development. This building is hundreds of years old and it still stands strong. The reason for that is that it's been constantly modified and updated for new standards, even though it looks very nice and it's functional for its purpose. Companies that work in construction can do that because they have defined sets of rules that they apply. They need that because they have to work in larger teams and because they know that what they build has to last for several years and they need different workers to build it and then different people to do the maintenance. As software developers, we also have to define those rules because our work also lasts for a very long time. And the report you build today will probably be modified by several others, or in our case, often we are at the opposite end. We end up maintaining reports that were designed by others, sometimes decades ago. So this is referred to as design patterns, and within our community, within the NAV community, we started to talk about design patterns about 10 years ago with this quote from Michael Nielsen. You probably all know Michael as the co-founder of ForNAV, but before that, Michael was working for Microsoft and Navision. And when he was working for Navision, he was the creator of the first CL compiler. If you're curious about design patterns and you want to know more, I can highly recommend reading these two books. One is about the NAV application design, and the application design book explains how all of the tables in NAV are glued together. And even though the version of the book is a little bit old, I can guarantee you that the basic application structure of NAV has not been changed in the last 10 years, not enough to make a difference at least. And the other book is dedicated to NAV patterns and explains how repeatable code can be written in NAV. So let's talk about design patterns and ForNAV, and I will try to explain you how we think you can improve the maintainability of your reports. If we look at the agenda, we'll start talking about leveraging features in ForNAV that don't exist in RDLC. If you attended one of my webinars before, I can't repeat enough that ForNAV is not RDLC. ForNAV is much more than RDLC. We will talk about how ForNAV has full dataset support and how we can use template reports and how template reports can help you avoid code cloning, and by avoiding code cloning, make it easier to maintain your report set. And then we'll talk about how to use argument tables to simplify the request page and how to send the data from the request page into your report and make it easier to translate your reports. Then we'll talk about using temporary tables and how temporary tables in ForNAV works together with declaring variables in JavaScript. And lastly, at the end, with the ForNAV report pack, we ship a number of API libraries. And the API libraries are also intended to reduce the amount of code cloning that you have in your reports and separate your report dataset from the business logic, because the ultimate result is to have a report which is simple enough to be modified by an end user and to separate the complicated business logic from your report and to separate your business logic into reusable containers. So you don't have to maintain the software in one place. So let's iterate once more that ForNAV is not RDLC. ForNAV is much more than RDLC. And if you work with ForNAV, for example, you don't need to have columns in a dataset. This is one of the hardest things to teach people if they are coming from an RDLC background. I can see that when I do second line support, and Rene can see that when he does trainings. We see that people consistently continue to use columns in Seaside, and that's not necessary. Actually, it's counterproductive because you have to maintain your report in two places, and it's much more productive to directly access the dataset from ForNAV. This avoids having to switch back and forth between the ForNAV designer and Seaside, and the ForNAV reports becomes the single source of the truth, which is what you want if you want easy to maintain objects. We also have native copy and page controls. This means that you don't have to include integer tables to create copies of invoices, and if you want to count the number of pages, you can use that using the ForNAV properties. And of course, we have native support for trans headers and trans footers. It's not necessary, like in RDLC, to count the number of lines in order to determine if you want to print subtotals and running totals. All of that comes out of the box. If we talk about full dataset support, it's important to know that we recommend avoid columns in a dataset at any time. I'll show you in a minute a demo where I explain the differences between ForNAV and RDLC. And it's also highly recommended after you have converted reports to switch to native ForNAV controls. And native ForNAV controls are, for example, the barcodes. We have native barcode support so that you don't have to call into web services, you don't have to use install fonts, you don't have to generate bitmaps and move them around, which is heavy on your service tier. And we also have native address formatting that avoids having to use CL coding and declaring global variables. And lastly, we also have the field lookups and we have the field captions that we automatically bring into the product. So enough PowerPoint for now. Let's go into the product and I'll show you where you can find all of this good stuff. And I'll start by going into I'll start with the standard Microsoft invoice. We all know this number by heart, report 206, the report that we all fear. It has to be changed with every single implementation. And if you open this report, you can see that your data set has a lot of columns. Some of the columns are labels. We have the integer loop and the page loop, and we have the address. The address by itself is from a global variable. And if I go to the globals of a report, you can see that we have so many global variables. And this is what makes people afraid of touching this. People are afraid of breaking stuff for good reasons. And we know by experience that by reducing the number of global variables, you also reduce the fear of making changes to the object. You should very much focus on separating the business logic from the user interface of a report so that we can go back to the situation where it's safe enough for end users to make small modifications to reports. So if we go to the ForNAV version of this report, immediately by designing the dataset, you can see that it's much simpler. We only have 2 columns in the dataset. All of the other tables, data items are tables. And if I go into my global variables, you can see that I only have 2 variables, and the other ones are the built-in ForNAV controls that we need to communicate with the server. The only 2 columns that we have here are a column that indicates if the sales invoice has discount, and a column that indicates the table name of this report. Both could actually be replaced by JavaScript, but for now it resides in Seaside. Also because the business logic doesn't have to change that often. And it's also important to see that the data source has a consistent name. And I'll talk more about that later during the webinar. But we always recommend to give your data source, data items, logical names, so you can refer to the tables as generic tables. And this makes it easier in the future to reuse things that you've already done in existing reports into new reports. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run the report, and I'm going to start the designer from the Windows client. And I have to wait for a moment for my client to wake up. Yep, it's waking up right here. And once the report is started up, I can set a flag to design the report from the request page. All of the ForNAV field reports have this flag, and a lot of developers have a hard time switching between designing a report from Seaside, because Seaside is the environment that we know, that we love, that we spend our day in. But we highly recommend switching we highly recommend switching from using Seaside to using the web client or the Windows client to design the reports. The reason for switching is sometimes we need to inject things into the Seaside object. From the ForNAV designer, you can add data items. From the ForNAV designer, you can add group total fields. And to do that, we have to inject that into Seaside, and for that we use PowerShell. And in order for PowerShell to be connected to Seaside, the designer has to be started from the Windows client. If you start the designer from Seaside, we cannot connect the designer to the Seaside backend. Simply doesn't work. So if I design the report, you will see that on the right I have my field list, and here you can see that I have the same data structure as in my report. And if I expand my header table, you can see that I have full access to all of the fields in my NAV database. And with all of the fields, I really mean all of the fields. Also, if you have extensions, all of the extension fields will also be carried forward into the report. So from that perspective, we're going a step further than Seaside is currently allowing you to do. But of the full access to the database, we also add the field captions. And the field captions allow you to drag in any caption from any field and have it automatically translated, so you avoid having to work with labels. We also have the field groups, and the field groups allow you to work with addresses. If your table has address fields, we automatically group them together in field group addresses, and we look at the country code, and based on the country code, we format the address in the correct way. And this avoids coding, this avoids declaring variables, this avoids adding variables to the data set. It avoids having to work in two different places, and it increases the maintainability of the report. It's so much easier. And we also have the field lookups. If your table that you base your ForNAV report on has table relations with tables that have code fields as a primary key, we automatically drag in the name to, the description, and the description to of those fields. And we also allow you to drag in the caption of the related table. In Navision, we have a lot of fields that end with either number or code. And if you print a Cronus invoice, you will see that the word code is printed a lot on your invoice. And as a Navision developer, we don't see that anymore. After 10 years or 20 years of Navision development, we don't see that code anymore. But for a customer, it's weird. A customer doesn't know what a location code is and a payment terms code. The customer only cares that it's a location and a payment terms. And for that, you can drag in things like header.fieldlookups.payment terms caption, and this will simply print payment terms. It will not print payment terms code. And we have the same here on the left. We have header.fieldlookups.customer caption. And this will simply print the word customer, not customer no dot. And it just makes your invoice prettier, and you can inherit the translation from the metadata in NAV. Of course, none of this is available after conversion. After conversion, we can only regenerate the controls that you had in RDLC or in native NAV in the old Navision. But we recommend that after converting the report, when you do periodical maintenance on your report, start upgrading these controls, because it will make your life so much easier in the future of maintaining your reports. You can also see that on top of the data set, I have a couple of other tables. I have full access to company information. I have full access to the ForNAV setup and the ForNAV legal conditions translations. And I have native translations, like I can use copy, continued, subtotal. All of those words are built into ForNAV. And if you use the built-in controls, they will automatically be translated into 20 languages that we ship built into the product. These variables, the company information and the ForNAV legal translation and the ForNAV setup, are carried in using JavaScript, and the JavaScript gathers the data from a records collection. If I go into my record collection, you can see I have company information, ForNAV setup, and ForNAV legal translation. And those are read into the database using AL code inside ForNAV. So inside ForNAV, you can write your own AL code, which is interpreted using a JavaScript engine in the background. But you can simply do a get statement or a find statement in ForNAV. And by doing this, you keep all of the business logic in one place. There's one source of the truth, and you can read all of this stuff when you start working with templates. Templates is the second part I want to discuss with you. Templating is very specific in ForNAV. None of the other products offer the templating features, and it allows you to reuse the effort that you have already put into existing reports. In the ForNAV report pack, we're using templates for sales documents, purchase documents, reminders, finance charge memos, service orders, and all of the financial statements. All of the reports in ForNAV have a consistent look and feel. And if your customer wants the logo to go from the left to the right, you only have to change it in the template, and all of the other reports inherit those changes. A very important property to remember if you start working with templates is the allow script errors property. If you work with templates, we recommend to use the largest table for your master report. In our case, for example, we chose the sales invoice report as a master for the invoice, for the sales documents. But for example, the invoice has a field which is called order number, and the order number field does not exist in the invoice if it's not posted yet. And normally, if you use a control which is not existing in a table, we would display a JavaScript error. And by switching the allow script errors to yes, you can suppress those errors. And that's a very powerful feature if you start working with templates. So we currently have our template open in ForNAV, and you can see that in my template, I can switch the design of the report. Let's also open a child report. In my case, that is report number 70,000. And I will actually go against my own recommendation. I will design this report from C-side just because I can and because it avoids starting a second instance of the Windows client. But if I design a second report in ForNAV, it opens the second report side by side with your existing report in the same instance of the designer. And this makes designing reports a lot easier because within the designer, you can switch back and forth between the two reports. And you can even copy and paste controls from one report to the other. And this makes working with reports a lot easier than constantly having to close and reopen the designer. You can see that the order confirmation has a different color controls than the template, and that's because it's connected to the template. And if I try to drag one of the controls away, it simply bounces back to the position where it started, because in my document header, I have used the master section property, and this master section is connected to the sales template. If I go to the sales template and I click on the document header, you can see that I have used the allow script errors property. This avoids having to print errors if controls don't exist. In this case, I have my table name here, and my table name is from my data set. And let me close the designer right now. And I'm going to ignore all of my changes. And I'm going to close my Windows client, at least this instance. And let's run the order confirmation again. And I'm going to open the order confirmation from the designer. And right now you will see that the order confirmation has picked up a change in the template. It has picked up the table name. The table name is a field in my Dynamics NAV dataset, but in my Dynamics NAV dataset, I don't have that field. And normally this would result in a JavaScript error, but if I run this report, which I can do from the preview because it's connected using the web Windows client, you will see that it does not print the error. It ignores the error. It ignores controls that don't exist. And this makes working with templates very flexible. And you can see we have customer instead of customer number. We have payment terms instead of payment terms code. And this is just easier to read. So let's go back to the PowerPoint and go to the next pattern. And this is by far my favorite ForNAV design pattern. And this design pattern is not limited to ForNAV. You can also apply this pattern in RDLC reports. But with ForNAV, we have a couple of extra benefits compared to RDLC, things that RDLC simply does not support. The problem or the reason I have invented this pattern, the reason I created this pattern is I was aggravated by the amount of global variables and the amount of effort that I had to do to bring data from a request page into my report. In a lot of cases, you need the data from your request page in your report. Sometimes you want to print whatever the user has put in a request page. Sometimes you want to hide a certain control or you want to hide a certain section in your report based on something from the request page. And the normal way of working with request pages is declare a variable, put the variable on request page, put the variable in your data set and start carrying it around. And then the next problem you create is the translations. Those fields have to be translated. They have to be translated in the request page. They have to be translated in the report. And it's just a lot of work. And to work around this, we have invented the argument table for reports. And let's go to Seaside and I'll show you a simple example of where we have used that. First, I will show you what it looks like in a standard Microsoft report. This is the sales statistics report. And if I design this report, first of all, you will see all of the fields in the dataset. But if I go to my request page has two fields, starting date and period length. And these fields are global variables in my report. And from the global variables, I carry them over to the request page. And every time I want to do something, I have to go back to Seaside. And that's just something I don't like. So let's go to the ForNAV equivalent of this report from our report pack. This is the ForNAV sales statistics report. And if I design this report and if I go to my global variables, the global variables are empty, right? All of these variables are created by the ForNAV converter and we don't touch them, we don't see them. And there's no global variables. But even though I have a request page and my request page has fields, I can show invoices, credit memos, and I can group by customers. And if you look at the source expression of these fields, it comes from a data source which is called args, which is an abbreviation for arguments. The first table in my report is my arguments table. And in this case, it's the statistics arguments, but I always call it args. I always call the name args because that allows me to reuse code and to copy and paste controls from one report to another report. Consistent naming makes working faster. If I go to the properties of this data item, it's a temporary table. And in this case, that is really powerful because I can determine how I want to populate this table. Let's X out of this report for now, and let's go to my table, which has the same number for convenient reasoning. This is my table, and you can see that in this case, the primary key of the table is currency code. In this report, I have the option to print statistics per currency or to have my statistics printed in my local currency. And if I go to my report, I have some code in my report. And this code is called arguments.createCurrencies. I like to write a lot of business logic inside of my argument table. My argument table becomes a container for business logic, and inside that container, all of the properties are local variables because they are fields in my argument table. And this is probably as close to object-oriented programming that you can get in AL or CAL, where you treat the table as a class. The table will never contain any real data in the database. If you go to SQL Server, the table will exist, but it will always be empty. And I determine, based on my business case, how to populate the table, to do it by currency or to do it for all currencies. This also has other benefits. The first benefit is that it gives my report a header and a tail, a header and a footer. I can use this to print my company logo and my company footer in a consistent way. And it also allows me to carry over the data from my report into my report designer. And I will show you that in the ForNAV trial balance. If I run the trial balance, you will see that the trial balance has a lot of fields in the request page. I thought I had pressed run, but apparently I did not. Now Murphy has gotten me in my demo. I'm betting all of you have had this experience once before. Somehow it decides to start a second instance of my Windows client. If I try to print my trial balance, I can set a lot of flags. I can make a lot of columns visible and invisible. And when I print this report, I want some of these options to be also printed on the report. Because in real life, in real companies, the companies we all work for, this report after printing goes to a manager, or it goes to a customer, or it goes to a vendor. And when that customer gets that report and he has a question about the report, I need to know which options I have selected when I printed that report. If I open this report in the designer, you can see that I have a header section, and in my header section I have a field which is called arguments.showBy. The argument table becomes a container for my report. Everything expands and collapses with my arguments table. My argument table becomes the container for my consistent header, which is connected to my template. If I want to change the way my report works with the logo, I only have to change it in my template. But it also becomes a placeholder for printing the values from the request page. And here also the translations are inherited. The translations will be done in my table, in my argument table, and my translations will be inherited from my argument table into ForNAV. So I never have to do a translation twice, which makes life so much easier, right? Translations are a pain. Nobody likes to do translations, and this makes doing the translation so much easier. The ForNAV report pack has a lot of argument tables. You can easily find them by filtering on asterisks and then args. I highly recommend using this naming convention because it will make it easier to find all of those tables in your solution. Of course, as an ISV, we get our objects for free from Microsoft. We can get 1,000 objects for free without having to pay for them. But even if you create customer-specific reports, I still recommend using argument tables because argument tables make your reports easier to maintain, and customers should look at the total cost of ownership. And if your customer doesn't care about adding fields to those tables themselves, those tables can be outside of the customer license. Because we use the temporary property, we don't insert data into SQL Server. And when you don't insert data in SQL Server, a table is outside of your license. It's free of charge. Microsoft only charges you for tables that you want to store data in or tables that you want to code in if you have application builder license. But if you don't want to do any coding for yourself as a customer and you don't want to store any data in the database, tables are free. And that's not a bug. It's not even a feature, it's design, right? So argument tables are a very important feature in the ForNAV report pack. And it leverages the power of temporary tables in NAV. And we can take it to the next step by starting to use temporary tables to simplify the dataset. And this is a balancing act. Most of the time in NAV, the data is stored in the table the same way it is displayed in the user interface. Navision is very WYSIWYG designed. But sometimes it's not the case. Sometimes you want to display the data in a different way. And if you do that, of course, you can start juggling with integer tables and you can declare a whole bunch of global variables, but that'll make your report very hard to maintain. And instead of doing that, we recommend using temporary tables. This requires a little bit more coding in the beginning, but if you do your coding separately, you separate your business logic from the UI, you will make the report a lot less scary to design by the end users. And your report will also become its own API. And this has more benefits than you would probably think at first. Microsoft is currently making very big changes to NAV. Microsoft, as we speak, is refactoring NAV to make it more object-oriented, to make it more decoupled. And if you have a report and you're very happy about the report and you want to continue using that report in the future, if your report has its own source table and Microsoft changes the way they store data in NAV, all you have to do to make the report work in the new version is fix the connection between your report and the data from Microsoft. So your data set will become its own API. And that's a very powerful feature if it comes to that. So The example that I want to show you in the ForNAV report pack is the aged accounts receivables report. Again, I would like to compare the standard Microsoft report with the one from the report pack. And to do that, I have to put a filter on my object. So here I have report 120, which is the standard aged accounts receivables report, and I have report 70220, which is the ForNAV aged accounts receivables. If I design the two reports and if I put them side by side, you can immediately see the difference in the complexity or simplicity of the data set. The standard report has a lot of global variables. It's all of the business logic is inside of the report. Sorry, I was in the wrong report. So a lot of global variables and also a lot of code. There's a lot of code in the report that has to be changed. And if end users see this code, or if consultants see this code, again, they are afraid of breaking stuff for a good reason, and they don't want to do it, and the work ends up on the desk of an expensive developer that you want to use for other projects, and probably the developer doesn't want to do it either. So with using the temporary tables, you simplify the data set and you simplify the look and feel of the report. Again, the report does not have a lot of global variables, only a reference to the currency table and the ForNAV aging calculation table. And if I go to my ForNAV aging buffer table, let's go to table 70220. All of the buffer tables have the same ID as the report objects. You can see that all of the fields that I need in my report are part of my table. And by that, they are carried forward to the report. If I go to the business logic, you can also see that, again, the argument tables become a container for the business logic. So if I go into the definition of this function, you can see that my temporary table becomes the place where I code. And by coding in a temporary table, the temporary table becomes a code unit with all of the fields as global variables for free. And it separates the business logic, which is scary for customers, which is scary for consultants, from the report. And the report becomes easy to look at. And the report is not as scary as it used to be with all of that code from an ancient past. Another thing I want you to very carefully see when you look at this report is that we have used generic names again. So we have args, account for customer, aging buffer, and currency totals buffer. If I run this report, and now I hope my Windows client is playing nice with me. If I run the report and if I design the report in the ForNAV designer, I can also see the biggest penalty for using temporary tables. Normally, if you use temporary tables, and I was executing the table instead of the report, I'm sorry. Normally, if I use a table as a data source for a report, I get all of the fields for free in my ForNAV report. But now, if I look at my arguments table in my aging buffer, I see that I have an account number and an account name, but I don't have the customer name and the customer address. And to work around that, I can use the JavaScript. I can go into my record collection and I can declare the customer table as a variable. And in my aging buffer data item, I can program in my onAfterGet record. And in my onAfterGet record, I can simply now say fields customer dot get, and then aging buffer account number. And this will read the customer from the database for every record in the aging buffer, and it allows me full access to all of the fields, including extensions from the database, including the field lookups, including the field groups, including the field captions. In this case, the account table is already there, and I'll talk a little bit more about that now. We are running a bit short on time, so we'll try to hurry up without losing you as my audience. What happens if I change this customer data source to a vendor data source? If I change that to a vendor data source, and if I go to Tools and I compile, the report compiles. And the report compiles because everything is consistent in the naming. And this allows me to say file, save as, and save it as a different number. And this allows you to very easily, for example, if your customer has a label and the label works for a customer, you save the report as another one for the contact, and you save the report as another one for the employee. Because in Navision, table fields are consistent. And this trick will save you a lot of time. I can guarantee you that. The last pattern I want to talk to you about is leveraging API libraries. And the reason we have API libraries in the ForNAV report pack is to avoid code cloning. And the second reason is to separate business logic from the report. Standard Navision reports have a lot of code cloning. If I go to the sales invoice and if I go to the sales line, if I go to the code, there is a lot of code in the report, like for example, populating the VAT amount line. And this code is duplicated. There's probably an instance of this code in every report. So fixing a bug becomes a nightmare. And it also makes the report, again, very scary for those of us who cannot code. The ForNAV reports don't have that experience. If I go to the code of a ForNAV report, you will see that the ForNAV reports don't have that scary code. We have some simple readable case statements, and that's it. Everything else has been put into libraries. The two most popular libraries that we have are the update of the number printed and the get number of copies field APIs. The get number of copies is a function in a code unit, and we use a global function instead of the onRun trigger because we want the code unit to be agnostic of the source table. And the only way to do that in NAV is by using variants. If I go to the local variables of this function, I can see that the variable is called rec to make it understandable. A CAL programmer will know that this is probably a record from the database, but the data type is variant, so it accepts anything in the system. And the first thing we do in the code unit is we convert the variant to a record reference. And this is generic code, and you can copy it if you want. It simply checks if the record is already a record reference, and then it moves it into a record reference. If it's a record, it gets the table into a record reference, and otherwise it will give you an error message that you should not call into this API with anything else but a record or record reference. Then it uses a little bit of reflection to find the customer number. We expect the table to have a bill to customer number in the table, and then we use a field ref to read the number of copies from the customer table. And you would be surprised how many tables in NAV this refers to. There's a few dozen tables that apply for this API to work. And you can probably make it more flexible if you change this to also have things like asterisk customer number, right? That will probably make it even more flexible. The other one is the update number printed API. Here we take the preview as a parameter, because if the report is previewed, we don't want to store the number of printed fields. Again, we convert it into a regref, and then we search for the number of printed fields in the object, and we simply assign the value number of printed. We modify the record, and we store the change in the database, right? Very simple way of coding. If I go into my report, let's go into the ForNAV sales invoice, the VAT variant. Here we have sales invoice header, which is called header. If I go to the code, I have a function here, update number printed. If I go to the definition, it simply says ForNAV update number printed dot update number printed, and it takes the header as a parameter and the curreport.preview. So now the $1 million question, what happens if I change this to 114 credit memo header? If I say file, save as, I have a credit memo, because the name is consistent and the API uses a variant and it searches for a field in the record ref, right? Super flexible. So I don't know why, but today, this afternoon, it took 10 minutes more to do this than it did this morning. But we are at the point of taking questions. So René, back to you.
We have no questions yet. So if anybody has any questions, now will be the time to ask them. Just type them into the questions window and we will try to answer them as best we can. In the meantime, if you want to know more, you can always check fornav.com and download a copy of ForNAV. You can use it without a license to test and trial and demo. You can check our YouTube channel for more exciting videos about ForNAV. And if you have any questions, just pop us an email and we'll try to answer that as well there. So Mark, I don't see any questions coming, so it might be time to end this webinar.
Yeah, we have someone saying great webinar, thank you. So Dave, thank you for the compliment. I was kind of expecting somebody to ask how drunk I was when I coded this, but that didn't happen. So thanks everyone, and see you next time.
Bye.